Elizabeth Taylor's 4 children were in the room when she died. Not at the edge of the story, not watching from a distance, in the room. They had been watching from a distance for most of their lives. Their mother was the most photographed woman on earth for 40 years. She married 7 times. She won 2 Oscars. She survived a tracheotomy, a near-fatal pneumonia, a brain tumor, a broken back, and a decade of addiction that her own son described as watching someone with deadened eyes plunge a needle into her own flesh. Her children absorbed it, quietly, from wherever in the world they had been sent that year. But something was taken from Elizabeth Taylor long before any of that. Something specific. On a morning in March 1958, when her husband Mike Todd boarded a plane she was too ill to board, and that plane went down near the Zuni Mountains in New Mexico, and she started screaming, and for a full month would not get out of bed, something left her that never came back. Her 4 children were somewhere else when it happened. They did not hear the screaming, but it would reach them, in different shapes, across different years. This is where it landed. Her mother was a stage actress who gave it all up to marry. That fact matters more than anything else in this story. Sarah Southern had once stood on Broadway stages under her own name, performed in her own light, wanted things for herself. Then she married Francis Taylor in 1926, moved to England, had 2 children, and stopped. Every ambition she had ever carried, she folded into a single daughter with violet eyes. By the time Elizabeth was 2, Sarah had enrolled her in singing and dancing lessons. By 10, Elizabeth was in front of cameras. By 12, she was National Velvet, a child star, MGM property, a face that belonged to the public before she understood what belonging meant. At 16, she reportedly begged to be allowed an ordinary childhood. Sarah's response, "But you're not a regular child, and thank God for that. You have a responsibility, Elizabeth. Not just to this family, but to the country now, the whole world." One biographer would later write that Elizabeth had become her mother's reason for living. She was a child. She had become someone's reason for living. And somewhere inside that, somewhere between the studio lights and the scripted romances and the magazine covers she had never agreed to be on, was a girl who wanted to be loved without an audience, who wanted to give her own children something her mother had never given her. Love that did not require performance. Love that had no cameras watching. She believed she could do this. Her first marriage, to hotel heir Nicky Hilton in 1950, lasted 7 months. He was abusive and alcoholic. Elizabeth was 18, had never chosen anything on her own terms, and had no template for what love looked like when no one was arranging it for her. Her second marriage, to the gentle British actor Michael Wilding, gave her 2 sons and a period of something resembling stability, but not the passion she had been told she deserved, not the life that was big enough to contain her. Then came Mike Todd. She was photographed with him at their honeymoon in Acapulco in February 1957. 24 years old, hair loose, eyes at full brightness. She wrote later, "God, I loved him. My self-esteem, my image, everything soared under his exuberant, loving care." That photograph is the last documented image of her before. Because on March 22, 1958, Mike Todd named the plane he boarded the Lucky Liz, and the plane went down. Everything that came after, every marriage, every addiction, every public collapse, every absence, flows from that one morning. It was not a single villain who broke Elizabeth Taylor. What broke her was accumulation. The first layer, her mother. Sarah Taylor did not believe she was causing damage. She believed she was giving Elizabeth everything. What she was actually doing was ensuring her daughter would never learn what she wanted for herself, because Sarah's wanting had colonized every room. Elizabeth never had the ordinary adolescence that teaches a person who they are when no one is watching. Her romances were announced before they were real. Her grief was public before it was processed. By the time she was 18, and marrying Nicky Hilton, she had never once chosen anything without an audience. The second layer, MGM. The studio owned her body, her image, her schedule, her hair, her weight. They medicated her. They managed her. They used her until the machinery of her was exhausted, then blamed her for breaking down. 3 of her doctors would eventually write a combined 1,000 prescriptions for 28 drugs over 5 years. That began with the studio system. It ended with her children organizing an intervention. The third layer, the one that changed the shape of everything, arrived on a March morning in 1958. What died with Mike Todd was not just a marriage. It was the only experience Elizabeth Taylor had ever had of being chosen without conditions. Todd had not been arranged by her mother or scripted by a studio. He had simply decided she was going to marry him. He was possessive and flamboyant and extravagant. He was also, for exactly 1 year, precisely what she had been starved of. Someone who found her magnificent without requiring her to perform magnificence. After he died, she spent the rest of her life trying to find that again. Eddie Fisher arrived first, grief dressed as love. She married him within months of Todd's death. She admitted it herself years later. We talked about Mike all the time. Eddie had known him and idolized him, so it was a way of keeping Mike alive. I guess that's pretty sick. Then Richard Burton. Twice. The passion was real. So was the wreckage. They burned through each other across 2 marriages and a decade of public theatre. When the second marriage ended in 1976, something in Elizabeth that had been reaching toward stability for 20 years stopped reaching. The pills became the architecture of her days. The alcohol became the furniture. The woman who had wanted to give her children ordinary love became someone her children had to organize an intervention to save. What entered her life was grief that had no private place to be grief. A wound too large for one person to carry, so it spread into every room she lived in, into every marriage she tried, into the childhoods of 4 people who had not chosen any of it. For a month after Mike Todd died, Elizabeth Taylor did not get out of bed. She was sedated heavily. She would not eat. At his memorial service, fans grabbed for her through the car window and tore the black veil from her face while she was still weeping. She was not allowed to be a widow. She was a spectacle. Even her grief was public property. 5 weeks after the crash, she was back on a film set, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which would earn her an Oscar nomination. The studio required it. The machine did not grieve. She had to keep moving or be left behind. What changed inside her was not simply that she became sad. It was that she lost the capacity to be still. Before Mike Todd, she had been a girl who wanted desperately to be loved privately. After him, she was a woman who no longer believed love was permanent, and who could not tolerate the silence that privacy required, because silence was where the grief lived. Her granddaughter Naomi Wilding would name it decades later, in a documentary. From the youngest age, all of her validation came about from that visibility. She created celebrity the way that we see it now. She was always giving material. There was so much to be seen. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't hiding. She couldn't. Hiding meant stopping. Stopping meant feeling what was underneath, and her children lived in the noise she made to stay ahead of it. They learned, each of them, in different ways, at different ages, that their mother's love was enormous and real and almost impossible to receive cleanly, that you could not separate the woman from the storm, that being close to Elizabeth Taylor meant absorbing some of the weather. They were not given a choice about that. What they did with the weather, that was the only choice they had. Michael Wilding Jr. was 5 years old when his stepfather's plane went down. Old enough to feel the rupture, not old enough to understand what it had broken. He was the eldest, which meant he carried something the younger children did not, a memory of before. Of the quieter household during Elizabeth's marriage to his own father, the gentle, fading British actor Michael Wilding, who was decent and incapable of holding Elizabeth's attention, and 20 years her senior. Of a mother who had not yet fully fractured. After Todd's death, the shape of his childhood rearranged entirely. Nannies replaced proximity. Boarding schools replaced continuity. Richard Burton arrived like a weather system and reorganized everything. Film sets on 3 continents became classrooms, with paid tutors filling the gaps between takes, while Elizabeth was transforming herself into Cleopatra in Rome, or shooting Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in Connecticut, or recovering from something in a hospital that the publicists described carefully. Michael Jr. was the child Elizabeth was still learning to be a mother to when Todd died, and the learning stopped. He left as soon as he was old enough to leave. He traveled to India. He formed a rock band. He tried acting in the 1980s, Dallas, Guiding Light, and set it down before it could swallow him. He became a sculptor in Santa Fe, New Mexico. His artist's statement reads, "I'm very moved by the shapes that occur when earth, wind, and water have their way with the environment. Earth, wind, water having their way with things." He had watched forces beyond anyone's control shape and wear something down until it became something different from what it had been. He had watched it happen to his mother. He had watched it happen to her marriages, her body, her capacity for stillness. He translated it into stone. He did not make it into a scandal. His 3 children became trustees of the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. He found a way to carry her forward that had nothing to do with the marriages or the diamonds or the chaos, just the work that mattered at the end. When she died at Cedars-Sinai in March 2011, Michael was the one who issued the family statement. "My mother was an extraordinary woman who lived life to the fullest, with great passion, humor, and love. We know, quite simply, that the world is a better place for Mum having lived in it." He said what the eldest is always asked to say. He said it, and then he went back to his studio in New Mexico, back to the stone, back to the shapes that emerge when things have their way with you. Christopher Wilding was 3 years old when Mike Todd died, the wrong age for it, young enough to have no framework for what had happened, old enough to remember everything that followed. He grew up with nannies. He later said that Elizabeth was still learning how to be a mother when he was born, that his early childhood was staffed rather than parented. He said this without anger. He said it as a fact. He believed her. He kept believing her for the rest of her life. Christopher was the child who stayed nearest to the wound, not because he sought it out, because he was, by temperament or by chance, the one who didn't look away. He was at boarding school when his mother's affair with Richard Burton became the international scandal of 1963. His classmates taunted him about it. They knew details about his mother's private life that he was still absorbing. He described those taunts later as unpleasant, a word so controlled, so carefully chosen, that you can feel the years of discipline it took to arrive at it. He grew up and built a quiet career in film editing, in photography. Behind the frame, not in front of it. He married Aileen Getty, which made headlines because everything adjacent to his mother made headlines, raised 2 sons, and moved to Calabasas, California, where he has lived privately ever since. And then his mother's addiction reached him directly. He was staying with her in the Washington, D.C. mansion she shared with Senator John Warner. The intercom buzzed. She asked him to come upstairs and help her with something. He has described what he found in precise, almost clinical language, as though exactness is the only way to survive the telling of it. She was holding a syringe of Demerol. She pointed to a spot on her thigh. She asked him to administer the injection. He refused. She looked at him, he said, with deadened yet disappointed eyes. She took a breath. She steadied her hand. She plunged the needle into her own flesh. He stood there. She did not look at him again. That image, his mother with a syringe, a son unable to help and unable to leave, the needle going in, is the inheritance Christopher Wilding received. Not the diamonds, not the Oscars, the needle. He organized the intervention. He flew the family in. He was, in his own word, petrified. She was a formidable woman. They sat in a room, and each of them said what her addiction had cost them. Elizabeth said afterward, "The family intervention stopped me so dead in my tracks. It leaves you totally speechless, and it's so sincere, and done with such love, that you know it must be agony for them." She went to Betty Ford. She recovered. She became a different version of herself, an AIDS activist who sat beside dying men the rest of the world had abandoned. Christopher took possession of her first Oscar after she died, the one for Butterfield 8. He keeps it on a bookshelf in his living room. "I'm thrilled to have the Oscar," he said. She was so beautiful, some people tended to overlook her great acting chops. He could have led with the needle. He led with the Oscar. When she had expressed regret to him in her final years, when she told him she felt she hadn't been a great mum, He gave her the only answer he had. I felt like she was a good mother. It wasn't easy to do. He is defending her still. He probably always will. I've been thinking about the cost of that sentence. Not excusing, not forgetting, holding both things at once, that she caused real pain, and that she was a good mother, and that it wasn't easy to do. That is not a sentence a person arrives at quickly. It takes years. It takes something being released that was never supposed to harden in the first place. Christopher Wilding didn't choose Elizabeth Taylor as his mother. He didn't choose the nannies, the boarding school taunts, the syringe, the intervention. He didn't choose to be the one who organized it, or the one who stood in that bedroom and watched. What he chose, what he kept choosing, all the way to the end, was her Oscar on his shelf. Her talent, remembered. Her. That is a particular kind of love. If you've ever come from a woman who wasn't easy to come from, you know what that choosing costs. You know exactly what it takes to hold both things and not let either one destroy the other. Liza Todd had never met her father. She was 7 months old when the plane came down. She would spend her entire life carrying a man she had no memory of, a father who had named his aircraft after her mother, who had died on his way to accept an award, who had loved Elizabeth Taylor in the only way that had ever felt, to Elizabeth, like enough. Richard Burton adopted Liza in 1964. He became her real father in every sense that proximity and devotion confer. His name attached to hers. She is Liza Todd Burton. But the original absence did not disappear. She grew up knowing the shape of it, that her mother had survived because of a cold, that the plane had been named after someone else, that the most intact version of Elizabeth Taylor died with a man Liza never got to see. She grew up on film sets between stints at boarding school in Switzerland. She was in Rome during Cleopatra. She was on location in whatever country Elizabeth and Richard were occupying that season. The family was always in motion. Stillness was not available. She tried acting once, a brief appearance in Anne of the Thousand Days, and stopped. She went to Hornsey College of Art in London. She went to the Art Institute in Los Angeles. She became a sculptor. She made equestrian bronzes, a life-size bronze calf in Gustard, and one piece that says more about who she became than anything else, a sculpture honoring the search and rescue dogs of September 11th, made from the salvaged steel beams of the World Trade Center. She took metal from one catastrophe and built a monument to the attempt to find survivors inside another. She did not go to Hollywood. She did not try to reclaim or replicate her mother's life. She lives in upstate New York. Her son, Quinn Tivy, serves as a trustee of the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. The love went somewhere. It always does. But it went somewhere quiet and private and made by hand. Maria Burton was born in Munich in January 1961 into circumstances that have never been fully disclosed. She had congenital hip dysplasia. She was placed in an orphanage. Elizabeth Taylor adopted her at the age of 3. She entered a family already shaped by the loss of Mike Todd, already in motion across continents, already organized around a woman who could not be still. She entered the middle of the story. She had no framework of before, no memory of a mother who was different, no older brother's recollection of quieter years to measure the chaos against. She arrived into it fully formed and had to build her understanding from the inside out. She tried modeling briefly. She stepped back. She became a social worker. That is the complete arc of her public choices. She is the child who most thoroughly refused the inheritance, not from ingratitude, but from clarity. She understood, perhaps more plainly than any of them, what the life available inside Elizabeth Taylor's orbit cost. She had seen what proximity to that much visibility did to a person. She chose the opposite with both hands. She chose the people whose crises no one was photographing. She was in the room at Cedars-Sinai on March 23, 2011. All 4 of them were. A family shaped by boarding schools on 3 continents, by serial upheaval, by fathers who came and went, assembled in a single hospital room and held each other until Elizabeth Taylor was gone. That, too, is a kind of answer. Elizabeth Taylor knew. In a recorded conversation that surfaced decades later, she described the family intervention with a precision that makes clear she had thought about it long and carefully. It leaves you totally speechless. It's so sincere and done with such love that you know it must be agony for them. She knew it was agony. She had been the source of it for the entirety of their childhoods. She had given them a love that was real, and a chaos that was also real. And she had watched them absorb both and build lives around the absorbing. She said later that the intervention hit her like being slapped in the face with reality. And then, I thought, my God, I thought I was a good mother. How have I allowed myself to do this to the people I love most in the world? She thought she was a good mother. That is not irony. That is the honest complexity of what she was. She brought the children on location. She tried to shield them from the press. Friends described her as the one who enforced the holidays, who would not let the chaos scatter them permanently. Christopher would later confirm it. She was a formidable woman, and she used that formidability on her children's behalf when she could. She expressed regret to him directly, not through a publicist, not in a memoir. She looked at what she had passed down, and she said, "I'm sorry," to the son who had stood in the bedroom and refused to administer the injection. She was not a woman who apologized easily. Nothing in her upbringing had taught her that vulnerability was safe. Her mother had taught her that vulnerability was a weakness the cameras would exploit. MGM had taught her that her emotions were scenery to be managed. Mike Todd's death had confirmed that the people you love most catastrophically leave. She apologized anyway. She went to Betty Ford. She recovered. She turned the energy that had run for 40 years on survival into something outside herself entirely. AIDS patients that the rest of the world was refusing to touch. She raised millions. She sat beside men who were dying and being ignored. Whether she repaid what she owed her children, that is not a question anyone else can answer. Only they could. And what they chose to say is the next part of this story. They all spoke carefully. Each of them, independently, developed the same approach. Tell the truth without dismantling her. Michael, the eldest, spoke in the language of public statements. Her legacy will never fade. Her spirit will always be with us. And her love will live forever in our hearts. He invoked the films, the philanthropy, the contribution. He said the world was better for her having lived in it. He was not wrong. He was also not complete. The eldest child rarely gets to be complete. Christopher spoke longer because he had more to account for. He described the nannies, the boarding school classmates and their taunts, the intercom buzzing, the syringe, the deadened eyes. He put each thing down carefully, like evidence. And then he said, "When I was older, she expressed regret. She felt like she hadn't been a great mum, but I felt like she was a good mother. It wasn't easy to do." His daughter Naomi Wilding, Elizabeth's granddaughter, 1 generation removed from the wound, said the thing none of the children quite managed to say. From the youngest age, all of her validation came about from that visibility. She created celebrity the way that we see it now. She was always giving material. There was so much to be seen. She wasn't hiding. The granddaughter named the mechanism. The children had lived inside it. Naomi could see its shape because she'd been close enough to study it, but not so close that it had become her heir. Liza said almost nothing in public. She has never said much in public. Her testimony is the sculpture made from the wreckage. Her testimony is her son carrying the AIDS Foundation forward. Maria said less than Liza. She became a social worker. Her testimony is every person in crisis she has ever sat beside and not left. The words are in the work. The silence is in the work. That is what this family learned to do with what was passed to them. Elizabeth Taylor died at 7:30 in the morning on March 23, 2011. Congestive heart failure, 79 years old. She had been hospitalized since early February. All 4 children were in the room. Michael Wilding Jr., 68 years old. Christopher Wilding, 56. Liza Todd, 53. Maria Burton, 50. This family, scattered by European boarding schools, by film sets on 3 continents, by 7 marriages and their endings, by the serial displacement that began on a March morning in 1958, came together in a single room in Los Angeles and stayed. The wound had not stopped, but it had changed shape. None of the grandchildren became tabloid stories. None of them recreated the marriages, the chaos, the visible dissolution. They became trustees, artists, social workers, private people. They took what was passed to them and made it quieter. Liza's son Quinn carries the AIDS work forward. Michael Jr.'s children joined that work. The cause Elizabeth built from late-life grief, from the rage she found when she finally had something external to fight for, is still moving, just differently. The wound entered this family through a stage mother in 1895 who gave up her own ambitions and poured them into a daughter who was never allowed to be ordinary. It moved through MGM and their contracts and their medications. It arrived fully formed on March 22, 1958, in the mountains of New Mexico. And then it passed, into the sculptor in Santa Fe, who makes things from what wind does to stone. Into the son who keeps her Oscar on his shelf and defends her still. Into the daughter who built monuments from salvaged steel, who gave the absent father's absence a shape she could put in a gallery. Into the woman who chose the unglamorous work of sitting with strangers in crisis, because she had learned, from the inside out, what it cost to be left. The wound changed. It did not stop. Elizabeth Taylor once said, her children made her the proudest of anything she had ever done. She meant it. She also knew, by the end, that pride was not the same as presence. That love, however enormous, was not a substitute for the ordinary dailiness of being there. She tried to make it right. It was late. It was real. She died surrounded by the 4 people who had absorbed the most of what had been done to her. They were all there. The last words belonged to the one who was closest, the one who stood in the bedroom, the one who refused, and then watched anyway, and who has been making peace with that moment for the rest of his life. She felt like she hadn't been a great mum. But I felt like she was a good mother. It wasn't easy to do. That is where the wound rests. In the distance between how she felt and how he felt. In the grace he gave her that she could never quite give herself. In a son who keeps his mother's Oscar on his shelf and calls it a thrill.